Is the world shifting away from the United States? In 2025, global politics is heating up as former allies rethink their ties with America. Trade wars, political tensions, and shifting alliances are shaking up the balance of power. Could this mean trouble for the US, or is it just the natural evolution of global influence? Which countries are making bold moves, and why are they distancing themselves? Stick around as we break down the top 10 nations turning against the United States this year. Some of these might surprise you. Let's dive into the biggest geopolitical shakeups of 2025. Number 1. Canada. If you think Canada is all about maple syrup and hockey, think again, because in 2025, the usually polite northern neighbor is playing hardball with the US trade wars. Diplomatic tensions and a growing Canada First movement have led to a drastic change in relations. In 2025, US tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel skyrocketed by 25%, triggering an immediate Canadian counterattack. Ottawa responded with an aggressive $12 billion tariff package targeting American exports, from cars to agricultural products. This wasn't just about money, it was about pride. According to a survey by the Angus Reid Institute, 78% of Canadians now believe their country should reduce economic dependence on the US, up from just 45% 5 years ago. But it doesn't stop there. Canada is actively seeking new economic partnerships. In fact, trade with China grew by 22% in 2024 alone, as Canada shifts its export focus. The Buy Canadian movement is also booming. Companies like Tim Hortons, Roots, and Canadian Tire have seen a 15% jump in domestic sales as Canadians actively avoid American brands. Diplomatically, things aren't much better. In a historic first, Canada voted against the US in 4 key United Nations resolutions in 2024, breaking decades of alignment. And military ties? Well, they're fraying too. The Canadian government has announced a $45 billion defense budget increase, focusing on homegrown military production rather than US arms. Even in sports, Canada is flexing its independence. Toronto's bid for the 2027 World Cup deliberately excluded US partnerships, a clear snub to their longtime ally. Socially, anti-American sentiment is also rising. A poll by CBC found that 61% of Canadians now hold a negative view of US politics, a huge leap from just 30% in 2019. With rising frustration over US interference in Canadian policies, such as the softwood lumber dispute and energy trade restrictions, Canada is no longer the little brother in the relationship. Instead, it's carving its own path, proving that even the friendliest of neighbors can become distant. Number 2. Mexico. For decades, Mexico and the US have shared one of the most complex relationships in the world. Neighbors, partners, rivals. But in 2025, things are changing fast. What was once a close trade alliance is now turning into a tense standoff. And it all starts with money. The US and Mexico trade over $725 billion worth of goods annually. But after a series of economic disputes, that number is starting to shift. It began with Trump-era tariffs, which returned in full force under a new US policy targeting Mexican steel and electronics, increasing costs by 35%. Mexico didn't just sit back. President Claudia Sheinbaum hit back hard with tariffs on American corn, wheat, and dairy, a move that hurt US farmers, who export $28 billion worth of goods to Mexico each year. But that's not the biggest shakeup. Mexico is starting to diversify its trade partners. Instead of relying on the US, Mexico has deepened its $112 billion trade relationship with China. In 2024, China invested $9.4 billion in new factories in Mexico, bypassing US tariffs by using Mexico's trade agreements to access global markets. This means fewer American factories and more Chinese companies moving into Mexico. Politically, the tension is boiling over. The issue of immigration remains a massive wedge. The US is pressuring Mexico to crack down on migration, but instead, Mexico is playing hardball, reducing cooperation on border patrols. This has led to a 27% increase in migrants reaching the US border, causing political chaos in Washington. Socially, anti-US sentiment is at an all-time high. A study from El Universal found that 69% of Mexicans now have a negative view of the US, a 22% jump from 2020. The biggest reasons? Economic bullying, political interference, and cultural disrespect. Many Mexicans now prefer to visit Europe and Asia over the US, and American tourism to Mexico is down 18% as resentment grows. The shift is clear. Mexico is tired of being seen as America's backyard. It's growing its own economy, choosing new allies, and proving that it won't be bullied into submission anymore. This isn't just a policy change, it's a new era for Mexico. Number 3. China. If the US thought it could outmaneuver China economically, 2025 is proving otherwise. The world's second-largest economy is now leading the charge against American influence, and it's not holding back. The $700 billion trade war between these two superpowers is escalating fast, and China is winning in ways few expected. First, let's talk trade dominance. The US once controlled global markets, but in 2024, China officially overtook the US as the world's largest trading partner, signing free trade deals with countries like Brazil, Argentina, and South Africa. Exports from China grew by 17%, while US exports dropped 9%. The Chinese yuan is gaining strength, with 14 countries now using it for major trade transactions, further reducing America's economic influence. China's biggest power move? Tech supremacy. While the US has been banning Chinese companies like Huawei and TikTok, China has countered by restricting American tech giants like Apple, Google, and Microsoft. As of 2025, over 60% of China's digital market runs on homegrown companies, effectively shutting out US competition. Even Tesla, which once dominated China's EV market, has seen sales drop by 35%, as Chinese companies like BYD and NIO take over. And then there's military expansion. The Chinese government has increased its military budget to $320 billion, expanding its presence in the South China Sea with new bases and alliances. Meanwhile, China's influence in Africa is growing. By funding $200 billion in infrastructure projects, it's ensuring long-term economic control over the continent's resources. Even diplomatically, the world is shifting toward China. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and even the Philippines are signing major deals with Beijing, reducing reliance on the US. Meanwhile, China's BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is now viewed as a serious rival to the G7, with more countries seeking to join. What does this mean for the US? A weaker dollar, fewer trade partners, and declining global influence. China isn't just rising, it's rewriting the rules of global power, and Washington is scrambling to keep up. Number 4. Russia. Russia has been at odds with the US for decades, but in 2025 it's taking things to a whole new level. With Putin still in power and stronger than ever, Russia is openly challenging America in every way possible, economically, militarily, and politically. Let's start with the war in Ukraine. The US has spent $150 billion supporting Ukraine since 2022, but Russia is proving resilient. By forging closer ties with China, Iran, and North Korea, Russia has doubled its military production, keeping the war effort alive despite heavy sanctions. Even worse for the US, Europe is showing cracks, with countries like Hungary and Slovakia pushing for an end to sanctions, weakening American influence. Then there's energy dominance. Russia controls 40% of Europe's natural gas, and despite US efforts to cut off Russian exports, Putin is making billions. New pipelines to China, India, and Turkey are keeping Russian oil flowing, while the US struggles with rising gas prices at home. Russia is also waging a cyber war. In 2024 alone, over 2,000 cyber attacks were linked to Russian hackers, targeting US infrastructure, banks, and even election systems. The Kremlin is now openly funding anti-US propaganda in Latin America and Africa, building alliances in regions the US once dominated. Perhaps the most shocking shift? The rise of the Russian ruble. While the US dollar remains dominant, Russia is leading the push to replace it in international trade. By 2025, Over 20 countries are now trading in ruble-yuan transactions, bypassing U.S. financial systems entirely. This is a direct challenge to American economic power, and it's working. Militarily, Russia is flexing its muscles beyond Ukraine. It's now conducting joint military exercises with China in the Pacific, sending warships near Alaska and Hawaii as a warning to the U.S. It has also increased its military presence in Africa, Venezuela, and even Cuba, echoing Cold War-era strategies. The bottom line? Russia isn't just resisting U.S. influence, it's actively working to dismantle it. The more sanctions the U.S. imposes, the more Russia finds new ways to thrive. And with the world slowly shifting eastward, Moscow's long game is becoming a reality. Number 5. Iran. If there's one country that knows how to survive U.S. sanctions and still come out swinging, it's Iran. The Islamic Republic has spent decades resisting American influence, and in 2025, it's taking things even further. While Washington tries to isolate Tehran, Iran is expanding its power across the Middle East, forming new alliances and striking back in unexpected ways. First, let's talk oil and money. Iran has one of the world's largest oil reserves, and despite U.S. efforts to choke its economy, Iranian oil exports hit 1.6 million barrels per day in late 2024, a 30% increase from the previous year. But here's the real kicker. Less than 10% of these transactions are done in U.S. dollars. Instead, Iran is trading in Chinese yuan, Russian rubles, and even gold, bypassing U.S. sanctions entirely. Then there's the military front. The Iranian government has boosted its defense budget to $24 billion, funding advanced missile programs and drone technology that's being exported to allies like Russia and Hezbollah. The U.S. Navy is already struggling to counter Iranian swarms of armed drones in the Persian Gulf, making oil shipments risky and expensive for American allies. Diplomatically, Iran is expanding its influence beyond the Middle East. It has strengthened ties with BRICS, joining Russia and China in an effort to create an alternative global order. In 2024, Iran signed a $60 billion trade deal with China, securing long-term economic stability. Meanwhile, it's also making friends in Latin America. Venezuela and Cuba have tripled their trade with Iran, further reducing U.S. influence in the region. Socially, Iran's population has become even more anti-American. A 2024 survey by Iran Poll showed that 82% of Iranians view the U.S. as their greatest enemy, the highest number in over a decade. While young Iranians continue to push for more freedoms, the government has effectively used U.S. hostility as a reason to tighten internal control and justify crackdowns on dissent. The bottom line? Sanctions aren't breaking Iran. They're making it more resilient. With new allies, growing military strength, and an economy that's learning to survive without the U.S. dollar, Iran is proving that it's not backing down anytime soon. Number 6. North Korea. For years, people thought of North Korea as a tiny, isolated dictatorship. But 2025 is showing the world a new reality. Kim Jong-un isn't just holding on to power. He's expanding his influence, forging powerful alliances, and making the U.S. more nervous than ever. Let's start with military might. North Korea now has the world's fourth largest standing army, with 1.3 million active soldiers and 4.7 million reservists. But it's not just about numbers. North Korea has successfully tested intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. In 2024, it shocked the world by launching a hypersonic missile that flew over Japan and landed in the Pacific, sending a clear warning to Washington. Economically, sanctions are failing to crush North Korea. The country has deepened its $10 billion trade partnership with China, which now accounts for over 90% of its imports. Even more surprisingly, North Korea has been selling weapons to Russia in exchange for food, fuel, and technology. U.S. intelligence reports estimate that over 1 million artillery shells and missiles have been shipped from North Korea to Russia for use in Ukraine. On the diplomatic front, Kim Jong-un is no longer a global outcast. He has held direct high-level meetings with Putin and Xi Jinping, strengthening ties with two of America's biggest rivals. In 2025, North Korea signed a security pact with Iran, creating a new military axis that directly opposes U.S. interests. Socially, North Korea is using anti-American propaganda like never before. State-run media constantly blames the U.S. for all of North Korea's hardships, and with the younger generation being raised on these beliefs, hostility toward America is at an all-time high. A recent survey of defectors found that over 85% of North Koreans genuinely believe the U.S. wants to invade their country. But perhaps the most shocking shift? North Korea is now exporting cyber warfare. In 2024 alone, North Korean hackers stole over $3.5 billion in cryptocurrency, funding missile programs and bypassing U.S. sanctions. The country is becoming a cyber superpower, attacking banks, corporations, and even government agencies worldwide. The result? North Korea isn't just surviving, it's thriving. With stronger allies, better weapons, and a growing global presence, the Hermit Kingdom is proving that it's far more dangerous than many assumed. Number 7. Argentina. If you thought Argentina was just known for tango, soccer, and steak, think again. Because in 2025, this South American powerhouse is turning its back on the US and charting its own course. And the biggest reason? Economics. Argentina has faced economic turmoil for years, with inflation hitting 211% in 2024, one of the highest rates in the world. But instead of turning to the US and the International Monetary Fund (IMF) for help, Argentina is making a radical shift. In a historic move, President Javier Milei announced that Argentina will increase trade with China, Russia, and Brazil, reducing reliance on the US dollar. In fact, in late 2024, Argentina became the first Latin American country to trade soybeans and beef entirely in yuan, cutting out the dollar entirely. Financially, Argentina is aligning itself with BRICS, the economic bloc that now includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. With over 42% of global oil reserves now controlled by BRICS members, Argentina sees this as an opportunity to escape U.S. economic dominance. The country is negotiating a $30 billion trade deal with China and Russia, a direct challenge to Washington's influence. Politically, Argentina is rejecting U.S. intervention. Washington has long tried to influence Argentina's economy through the IMF, which has lent Argentina over $57 billion since 2018. But now, Milei is actively seeking alternative financial partners, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to break free from U.S. control. Socially, anti-U.S. sentiment is rising. A 2024 survey found that 56% of Argentinians believe the U.S. has too much control over their country's economy. This has led to a resurgence of nationalist pride, with younger generations supporting policies that prioritize Argentine sovereignty over Western influence. And let's not forget about military moves. Argentina is buying fighter jets from China, rejecting U.S. military aid for the first time in decades. In a bold geopolitical move, Argentina is also strengthening ties with Russia and Venezuela, openly opposing U.S. foreign policies in Latin America. Argentina is proving that it won't be bullied by the U.S. anymore. With new economic partners, shifting alliances, and rising national pride, the country is breaking free from Washington's grip and reshaping the balance of power in South America. Number 8. Brazil. Brazil has always been a global powerhouse, home to the Amazon rainforest, world-class football, and a massive economy. But in 2025, it's making a bold move away from U.S. influence and carving out a new path. First, let's talk economics. Brazil is the 12th largest economy in the world, with a GDP of $2.1 trillion, but in recent years it's been frustrated by U.S. trade policies. While the U.S. remains one of Brazil's biggest trading partners, China has now surpassed it, accounting for 35% of Brazil's exports, a figure that was just 21% in 2018. In 2024, Brazil signed a $50 billion trade deal with China, agreeing to ditch the US dollar and conduct transactions in yuan and Brazilian reais. This is a game changer because it further weakens the dollar's dominance in Latin America. Then there's BRICS, the economic alliance that Brazil co-founded. With Brazil leading the charge, BRICS now controls 42% of global oil reserves and over 40% of the world's population. In 2025, the alliance announced a new BRICS currency project, directly challenging the US dollar in international trade. Washington is worried, and for good reason. Politically, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has grown colder toward Washington. He publicly criticized US sanctions on Russia, refused to send weapons to Ukraine, and even hosted Vladimir Putin in Brasilia in 2024. Lula has also deepened Brazil's military ties with China, purchasing fighter jets, drones, and missile defense systems, a clear snub to the US. Socially, anti-US sentiment is rising in Brazil. A 2024 poll found that 59% of Brazilians believe the US exerts too much control over Latin America. Many blame American trade policies for keeping Brazil from reaching its full potential. With a booming economy, stronger military ties with China and Russia, and a growing movement against US influence, Brazil is proving that it's no longer a follower. It's a leader in the New World Order. Number 9. South Africa. For years, South Africa was seen as America's key ally in Africa. But in 2025, it's making a dramatic shift toward China, Russia, and BRICS. Let's start with economics. South Africa is the second largest economy in Africa, with a GDP of $399 billion. It's also Africa's largest producer of platinum, gold, and diamonds, giving it enormous influence over global markets. The problem? The US isn't its biggest buyer anymore. In 2024, South Africa's trade with China hit $68 billion compared to just $14 billion with the US. This shift is pushing South Africa further away from Washington and deeper into BRICS. Then there's military strategy. In 2024, South Africa hosted joint military drills with Russia and China, a direct challenge to the US Navy's influence in the Indian Ocean. The South African government has also refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a move that angered Washington but strengthened its ties with Moscow. Diplomatically, South Africa is championing a new global order. President Cyril Ramaphosa has publicly criticized US sanctions on developing nations, calling them economic warfare. In 2025, South Africa announced a $20 billion trade deal with Russia, bypassing Western sanctions entirely. Socially, South Africans are becoming more skeptical of the US. A 2024 survey found that 62% of South Africans believe the US uses its power to exploit African nations. The US once had strong influence in South Africa, but now more people see China and Russia as better partners. With its booming economy, growing military partnerships, and a public that's tired of US influence, South Africa is positioning itself as Africa's leader in the anti-US movement. Number 10. Turkey. Turkey has always been a wild card, a NATO member that doesn't always play by US rules. But in 2025, it's going even further, openly challenging Washington on multiple fronts. First, let's talk military. Turkey has the second largest army in NATO, with over 425,000 active troops. But instead of strengthening ties with the US, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is buying more weapons from Russia and China. In 2024, Turkey finalized a $7 billion deal for Russian S-400 missile systems, directly defying US sanctions. Economically, Turkey is turning away from the US dollar. Trade with Russia hit $70 billion in 2024, and Turkey has agreed to buy Russian energy in rubles instead of dollars. Meanwhile, China has invested over $30 billion in Turkish infrastructure, including new high-speed rail projects and ports, deepening their economic ties. Politically, Turkey is frustrating Washington by blocking Sweden's NATO membership, opposing US policies in Syria, and strengthening relations with Iran. Erdogan has also voiced support for Palestinian independence, a stance that has increased tensions with Washington. Socially, Turkish public opinion has turned against the US. A 2024 poll found that 73% of Turks believe America is an untrustworthy ally, the highest level of anti-US sentiment in decades. Many blame Washington for trying to interfere in Turkish affairs, and Erdogan is using this to rally nationalist support. Turkey's growing independence is a nightmare for Washington. As a key NATO member, its pivot toward Russia and China weakens the alliance and gives America fewer options in the Middle East.